So hopefully by now you're beginning to get into Jesus' teaching from the Sermon on the Mount. And perhaps more importantly, hopefully by now you've been captured by that vision that he laid before us last week. The vision of the church, of Christians, as being like a city on a hill, a light that shines out, that draws people in like moths gathering to a light from all around, so that they then give praise to our Father in heaven. Wouldn't it be wonderful if people thought of Crossway, Stratford and the people who make up that church as being like a light shining in a dark place, particularly at this fractured and broken moment in our society? It's a wonderful image, light shining on a hill, or salt Jesus gave us, salt in society. Two wonderful pictures that are underpinned by the attitudes of the beatitudes. You remember them from a couple of weeks ago? Attitudes that are characterized by meekness, by brokenness of spirit, poverty of spirit, by hunger and thirst for righteousness, a dependence upon God that says we can't do it ourselves, we need your grace to come towards us, but it is rewarded with wonderful things like a place in the kingdom of heaven. Well, this is the image that Jesus has given to us to aspire to. It's all about life following in his footsteps. Do you remember he came, he said, to fulfill the law? And as you read through the gospel accounts, you know that's the case. Always, only, ever perfectly living in obedience to his Father's will as expressed in the law. But he said to us, I want you to follow in my footsteps now. Don't reduce the commands, don't minimize them, don't get rid of them. Live in obedience to what I've said. Well, that's the glorious vision that's driving the Sermon on the Mount, and that should motivate us to want to take Jesus' teaching seriously. But the one thing that Jesus says is the greatest threat to us living out these standards is hypocrisy. Hypocrisy. You may not have thought that. You might have thought it would be something different, but that's what Jesus wants to make his target for much of the rest of the Sermon on the Mount. It's why he said what he said in verse 20 of chapter 5. Remember last week, Jesus said, I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, let's be clear what Jesus isn't saying there. He's not saying, look, the scribes and the Pharisees, they're great guys. They are the model of the Christian life. They're the best you can get, and you've got to do better. No, quite the opposite. We know, don't we? It tends to be that the word Pharisee and often scribe, they're the bad guys in the New Testament. And the reason is because they are hypocrites. If you want to see a pretty devastating expose of their hypocrisy, turn to chapter 23 of Matthew's Gospel, a whole chapter devoted from Jesus to the Pharisees, gunning at them for their hypocrisy again and again. Woe to you, woe to you, woe to you, he says, because of their hypocritical approach to life lived in God's kingdom. Well, Jesus hates it. He hates it because, of course, in the first instance, when you think about it, nothing is going to undermine this image of the light shining on the hill like hypocrisy. You've probably come across it before for yourself when people who aren't Christians say, no, I could never be a Christian because Christians are hypocrites. Now, often they're just throwing it out there because it's an easy line. But when it's true, it's devastating. It undermines the cause of the kingdom because it's like a facade. And if you realize there's nothing beneath it, you don't want anything to do with it. But hypocrisy is also corrosive for Christians ourselves. It eats away at us. It deludes us and deceives us, if you like. Makes us think on the surface everything's okay, when underneath there's no attempt to follow in Jesus' footsteps. Now, Jesus hates hypocrisy. He knows it's the thing that will undermine this glorious vision, and so he goes hard against it for the next few verses. And so that's what we're going to be looking at for the next couple of weeks. Jesus teaching against hypocrisy, pointing to a deeper, richer standard that will fulfill this salt and light vision. Now, hypocritical religion works in a particular way. Like I say, it's all about front. It's all about facade. But the way that you get away with putting up a front and deluding yourself is by Well, lessening the commands of God in some way or another. Oh, he says this, but it just means this. You sort of water it down a little bit, and all of a sudden you play yourself on sides. Lessening the commands, or by limiting the commands. You say, oh yeah, Jesus or God, he gave that command, but it only applies in that very specific way, in that very specific expression. It doesn't really apply to what I've got going on in my life. Or sometimes hypocrisy expresses itself by coming up with a whole load of new commands. It's quite clever, this one. You come up with lots of new commands that sound like the old command and have lots of new details attached to them, but are in fact a distraction from what God was saying in the first place. You're preoccupied with the little details that you can keep, but you miss the command that was at the heart of things. Well, as we go through the Sermon on the Mount this evening, you're going to see all of those different things expressed. The structure of Jesus' teaching for the next few minutes is fairly straightforward. It breaks down into blocks that all begin with these words. Jesus will say, "You have heard it said, but I tell you this. You have heard it said, but I tell you this." It's a pretty easy structure to follow, and it's there this week and in next week's section. And you can break the material up according to that. But every time Jesus says, "You have heard it said," he's either quoting directly from the Old Testament, or he's quoting a distorted version of the teaching of the Old Testament. But either way, what he goes on to say takes on the hypocritical watering down or limiting or addition of the hypocrites. More than that, though, then he points to the better way, the deeper way, the salty way, the light shining way. And so as you move into this material, remember to pray, remember to read it, remember to decide who's going to lead you through the questions, maybe set yourself a time limit so you don't run on for too long, and be realistic about how much you can cover. And then brace yourself for challenge, because Jesus is aiming to challenge us. But remember, if we can live this out, we'll be like the salt of the earth and the light on the hill.